Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let's get right into the sources we're looking at today.
Yeah, so the year is 1025,
Right.
and the heavy, humid air along the Coromandel coast of southern India is, well, it's thick with the scent of salt, cut timber, and just the sheer scale of human mobilization.
Thousands of people working simultaneously.
Exactly. Looking out over the water, the horizon is completely obscured by a massive fleet. Hundreds of vessels sitting at anchor in the swell.
And these aren't your typical warships, right?
No, these are sturdy, wide-hulled merchant ships. But they've been heavily modified for war, and they're flanked by sleek oar-powered galleys.
Right, the decks are just packed.
Are packed with specialized archers, crossbowmen, and infantry, who are trained specifically for hand-to-hand combat on the unstable pitching decks of ships.
Which is a highly specialized skill set.
It really is. And this armada is not preparing for a local skirmish. They certainly aren't heading out for a routine trade run.
No, they're turning their bows east.
Right, preparing to cross the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean to execute a calculated, devastating strike against the Chola Empire.
Which is located in modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yeah, and this is the Chola Navy, operating at its absolute zenith, securing a maritime domain that dominated the trade arteries of the medieval world.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into a vast stack of historical records.
Right, copperplate inscriptions, architectural studies, and even Song Dynasty trade logs.
All to unpack the Chola Empire. Our mission here is to understand how this South Indian dynasty fundamentally shaped geopolitics, international maritime commerce, and religious art.
From the 9th to the 13th century. But looking at the sources, a major question immediately jumps out.
What's that?
Well, when we study medieval empires, the standard image is usually heavily land-based.
Yeah, we picture massive cavalry charges.
Exactly. Sprawling infantry lines marching across plains, fortresses built on strategic hills.
You don't typically picture an empire projecting power across an ocean.
Right, to a territory thousands of miles away. So how exactly did a regional power, situated in the river valleys of southern India, transform into a transoceanic maritime titan?
To understand that 11th century naval peak, we actually have to look far backward.
Into the early origins.
Exactly. The foundation of this maritime reach was built entirely on the agrarian and economic stability of their homeland.
Ah, so it starts with agriculture.
It always does. The Chola roots go deep into the fertile soil of the Kaveri River Delta.
The sources mention the earliest textual references we have date back to the Sangam period.
Right, which stretches roughly from 300 BCE to 300.
Yeah, and the texts say they show up in the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka's Major Rock Edict No. 2.
Which dates back to the 3rd century BCE.
So why is an inscription on a rock hundreds of miles to the north significant for understanding the early Cholas?
Well, being explicitly mentioned in an Ashokan edict serves as a crucial diplomatic and political marker.
Because Ashoka was so powerful.
Exactly. He ruled a hegemon that covered nearly the entire Indian subcontinent.
Right.
Right. And in this specific edict, he lists the Cholas, alongside the Pandyas, as an independent southern kingdom sitting just outside his imperial borders.
Oh, so they weren't conquered by him.
No, they were independent. He documents that he provided them with Buddhist Dhamma propagation.
And medical facilities too, right, for humans and livestock.
Yes, which tells us that by the 3rd century BCE, the Cholas were not merely a loose collection of tribes.
They were a recognized polity.
A recognized, organized state capable of engaging in diplomacy with the most powerful empire in the region.
They were establishing themselves as one of the 3 crowned powers of ancient Tamilakam.
And the absolute key to their early success, and really the bedrock of their later imperial power, was the management of the Kaveri River.
The sources place a heavy emphasis on wet rice cultivation in this region.
It's the economic engine.
Could you break down why wet rice specifically, as opposed to other crops, becomes the driving force for this entire civilization?
Sure, so wet rice cultivation is highly labor-intensive, but its caloric yield per acre is unparalleled if managed correctly.
Meaning it feeds a lot of people for the amount of space it takes up.
Exactly. Unlike dryland farming, wet rice requires standing water for much of its growth cycle.
Right, flooded paddies.
Yeah. So when you harness a river system like the Kaveri and create a controlled environment of flooded paddies, you can produce multiple massive harvests a year.
And that leads to a population boom.
A massive caloric surplus allows the population to densify.
which frees up people to do things other than farm.
Precisely. It frees up a significant portion of the population from daily subsistence farming, allowing them to become artisans, soldiers, merchants, and administrators.
You cannot build a blue water navy or fund an expeditionary army without that surplus.
Or construct monumental granite temples, right?
Yeah.
You need a reliable, massive agrarian surplus feeding the people who build them.
That makes perfect sense. But a river like the Kaveri is subject to the monsoon cycle.
It floods violently and then recedes.
So how did they tame a river of that magnitude using ancient technology?
Well, the texts mention an early ruler named Kurikala Chola and something called the Kalani.
The Grand Anacut, right?
Yes. Kurikala Chola is a highly venerated figure in early Tamil history, and the Kalani is a testament to early hydraulic engineering.
How does it work? Is it just a big wall?
Built across the mainstream of the Kaveri River, it is not a dam in the modern sense.
Right.
It's not a massive concrete wall stopping a river completely. It was a stone barrage.
How did they build a stone barrage in a fast-flowing river?
The engineers strategically dumped massive, unhewn boulders into the riverbed.
To trap them in.
Yeah, and these boulders sank into the sand, forming a solid foundation.
I see.
Over time, they built this up to divert the fast-flowing floodwaters into a complex network of irrigation canals.
While still allowing the excess to flow downstream.
Exactly. This prevented the devastating seasonal flooding of the delta and distributed the water evenly across thousands of acres of farmland.
That kind of infrastructure turns a volatile seasonal river into a highly predictable year-round economic engine.
And once you have that domestic economic engine running, trade naturally follows.
Yeah, I read translated excerpts from Sangam poetry, specifically a work called Patnapalai.
It describes the coastal port city of Puhar.
Right. Incredibly vivid detail. It mentions foreign merchants, referred to as Yavanas, typically Romans living in the city.
Bringing gold and wine in amphorae.
Exactly, to trade for spices and fine textiles.
The Sangam literature provides a window into a highly cosmopolitan society. The port of Puhar was a nexus of global trade long before the medieval era.
And this was all driven by the monsoon winds, right?
Monsoon winds dictated this commerce entirely.
So merchants from the Mediterranean would ride the winds across the Arabian Sea, dock at South Indian ports.
Trade their heavy bullion for high-value, low-weight luxury goods.
Like black pepper, pearls, and muslin cloth.
And then wait for the winds to shift to sail back.
The early Cholas grew incredibly wealthy by taxing this flow of goods and facilitating the markets.
But then, after this vibrant early period, there is a massive gap in the historical record.
Yeah, we hit something called the Calabra Interregnum, which spans from the 3rd to the 6th centuries.
The sources indicate that these Calabras sweep in, displace the traditional Tamil monarchies, and the Cholas are completely subordinated.
They are reduced to minor chieftains. It reminds me of a perennial plant in winter.
How so?
Well, the leaves die back, the flower is gone, and on the surface, the plant appears dead.
Right.
But the root system is still intact underground, holding energy, waiting for the right environmental conditions to sprout again.
That's a solid analogy. How does a dynasty survive centuries of total political obscurity only to eventually spring back to imperial status?
Exactly my question.
Well, the root system in that analogy is the Kaveri Delta itself and the deeply ingrained social and agrarian structures that survived the political upheaval.
So even if the kings change, the farmers don't.
Right. The Kabras may have claimed the overarching political authority, but the day-to-day realities of life did not change for the average farmer.
The wet rice economy kept going.
The management of the irrigation canals, the local village councils, the basic fabric of society continued to function.
And the Cholas just waited it out.
The Chola lineage persisted in the margins, maintaining their local influence and waiting for the broader geopolitical climate to destabilize.
And that destabilization happens in the middle of the 9th century.
Specifically, the year 848.
Right. Enter Vijayalaya.
A chieftain claiming direct descent from the ancient Cholas of the Sangam era. He identified a strategic vulnerability.
What was the vulnerability?
The southern peninsula was locked in a grueling conflict between the two dominant powers of the time.
The Pallava dynasty to the north and the Pandya dynasty to the south.
Exactly. Vijayalaya executed a highly calculated strike while the larger powers were distracted.
And he captured the city of Thanjavur from a group of chieftains known as the Muttarayar.
By taking Thanjavur, he effectively reclaims the heart of the Kaveri Delta.
He secures that indispensable agrarian base we talked about.
Taking Thanjavur was the geopolitical equivalent of securing the primary power grid.
It's the definitive revival of the dynasty.
And to solidify his claim, He commissioned the Viralaya Cholswarm Temple,
signaling a firm royal patronage of Shaivism.
and laying the groundwork for his descendants to transition from regional survival to aggressive territorial expansion.
Which brings us to the period where the Cholas become an expansionist machine.
Looking specifically at the reigns of Rajaraja I, ruling from 985 to 1014.
And his son, Rajendra I, who ruled from 1014 to 1044.
These two men represent the apex of Chola power.
So how did Rajaraja I begin this process of massive consolidation?
He systematically dismantled the neighboring powers. He launched campaigns against the Cheras on the western coast,
And the Pandyas to the south.
effectively unifying the entire southern peninsula under a single administration.
But land power wasn't enough, right?
No, he recognized that to control the trade routes, land power was insufficient.
So he turned his attention southward and annexed the northern half of Sri Lanka.
Capturing its ancient capital, the Vanuratapura.
The sources point out that he accomplished this through heavy use of naval fleets.
Yeah, which is complex.
How did a medieval land army coordinate with a navy to conquer an island nation?
It required sophisticated combined arms tactics.
Like what?
Well, the Chola fleets were utilized to blockade key coastal ports, cutting off the Sinhalese defenders from external reinforcement or resupply.
Ah, so they isolate them first.
Exactly. Simultaneously, the transport vessels ferried massive numbers of infantry and cavalry across the Palk Strait.
Allowing the army to outflank landward defenses.
But the tactical victories were really secondary to the ideological shift taking place.
What do you mean?
Rajaraja and his son Rajendra ceased viewing themselves as mere regional Tamil kings.
They started using different titles.
They adopted expansive titles like Chakravarti, which translates to the Emperor of the Three Worlds.
They began to operate under the psychology of universal monarchs.
And that psychology manifests physically during the reign of Rajendra I,
Because he pushes the empire's reach significantly northward.
launching an immense military expedition all the way to the Ganges River basin.
I want to pause and consider the sheer logistics of an undertaking like this.
It's staggering.
We were talking about moving an army. Thousands of war elephants, thousands of cavalry horses, tens of thousands of infantrymen.
And the massive supply train required to feed them.
Moving all of that from Tamil Nadu up through the eastern seaboard of Odisha and Bengal, all the way to the Ganges River in the 11th century.
It's a huge distance.
Why commit such enormous resources to a campaign so far from home? Was this purely for resource extraction to plunder the wealthy northern kingdoms?
Or was there a deeper mechanism of legitimacy at play?
Yeah, which was it?
While acquiring wealth and securing northern trade routes were certainly secondary benefits, the primary stated objective of the campaign was profoundly symbolic. The entire expedition was framed as a quest to bring the sacred, purifying water of the Ganges River back to the south.
Really? They marched an army that far just for water?
Yes. Upon his victorious return, Rajendra I did not just distribute the water, he constructed a completely new, monumental capital city.
Named Gangakanda Cholapuram.
Which literally translates to the city of the Chola who took the Ganges.
So the logistical nightmare of moving an army thousands of miles was undertaken to acquire water to consecrate a new capital.
The water was the physical manifestation of political dominance.
Oh, I see.
By bringing the Ganges water south and pouring it into a massive artificial reservoir in his new capital, a tank known as the Chola Ganga.
He symbolically incorporated the sacred geography of northern India into his own sovereign domain.
Exactly. He was demonstrating to every rival state that Chola military capability had no terrestrial limit within the subcontinent.
But the terrestrial limit is where the narrative shifts.
Because they did not stop at the shoreline.
Right. While the land campaigns to the Ganges were vast, it was the eastward projection across the open sea that distinguished the Chola military apparatus from its contemporaries.
This leads us back to the scene we set at the very beginning of this deep dive.
The 1025 naval raid on the Srivijaya Empire.
Yes. Rajendra I dispatched an armada across the Bay of Bengal, striking multiple ports, including Kadaram and Panay.
How did a state whose core strength was river delta agriculture suddenly field a transoceanic armada?
Well, the records state they utilized a system known as STUFT.
Ships taken up from trade.
Exactly.
Could you explain the actual mechanics of that? How do you take a merchant vessel designed for hauling spices and convert it into a warship capable of attacking heavily defended ports?
The Cholas did not maintain a massive standing blue water war fleet year-round.
Because the maintenance costs would drain the treasury.
Exactly. Instead, they leveraged the existing maritime infrastructure of the Coromandel coast.
So they used what the merchants already had.
The shipbuilders there constructed massive, wide-hulled merchant vessels using techniques like stitched planking.
Stitched planking. They sewed the ships together.
Essentially, yes. Heavy wooden planks were bound together using highly resilient core rope made from coconut fibers rather than rigid iron nails.
That sounds weaker than nails.
Actually, it gave the hulls flexibility to absorb the shock of rough seas.
Ah, clever.
When the emperor declared war, these vast merchant fleets were requisitioned by the state.
And how did they militarize them?
They reinforced the decking to support the weight of hundreds of armored soldiers.
Right.
They also installed heavy timber barricades along the gunnels to deflect incoming arrows and projectiles.
And they integrated specialized galleys alongside them.
They did. While the modified merchant ships acted as troop transports and floating fortresses, they were accompanied by sleek, shallow draft galleys.
Powered by banks of oars.
Exactly. These galleys provided maneuverability in combat and could navigate the shallow estuaries of the targeted ports.
How did they actually fight when they got there?
The tactics involved utilizing the higher decks of the merchant ships as firing platforms.
Like elevated towers on the water.
Archers and crossbowmen would lay down continuous long-range suppressive fire
Clearing the enemy docks and defending vessels.
before the heavy infantry boarded for hand-to-hand combat.
That paints a vivid picture of the tactical execution.
They sail across the ocean. They systematically sack at least 14 distinct Srivijayan ports.
And they even capture the Srivijayan king.
They do.
But looking at this from a strategic perspective, I find a major contradiction.
What's that?
If the Cholas possessed the overwhelming military power, the logistical capability, and the capital to subjugate 14 heavily defended ports across an ocean, why didn't they stay? Why go through the immense cost of this expedition only to turn around and sail home? Why not colonize Southeast Asia and establish it as a permanent province of the empire?
To understand the withdrawal, we have to look at the macroeconomic theory driving the expedition. The Srivijaya Empire held a very specific geographic advantage. They controlled the Malacca Strait.
That narrow body of water connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea.
Right. Srivijaya was operating essentially as a massive toll booth,
So they were monopolizing the port fees.
demanding exorbitant tariffs and forcing foreign merchants to use their intermediaries.
And this bottleneck was severely hindering the flow of Indian Ocean commerce.
Particularly the highly lucrative direct trade between the Chola merchants and the Song dynasty in China.
So the Cholas did not need to administer the jungles of Sumatra.
No, they just needed the sea lanes open.
Comparing this to modern geopolitics, it's less like a war of territorial annexation and more like a forceful breaking of an economic blockade.
That is an accurate assessment. It was a highly calibrated, punitive expedition designed to inflict maximum economic disruption on a trade rival.
The objective was to physically dismantle the Srivijayan toll collection infrastructure.
Burn their naval assets and force a restructuring of the regional power dynamic.
Once the Srivijayan monopoly was broken, the sea lanes were opened.
And favorable trading terms were established for Tamil merchants.
The cost of permanently occupying and garrisoning overseas territory just outweighed the benefits.
So the Chola fleets achieved their strategic goal and withdrew.
This really challenges the fundamental way we often view ancient Indian states.
How so?
There's a persistent narrative that these states were generally inward-looking.
Right, bound exclusively to the land.
And perhaps hesitant to cross the open ocean due to cultural or religious taboos regarding overseas travel.
Yet here we see a state executing a complex transoceanic naval strike specifically to manipulate macroeconomic trade flows.
It demonstrates a highly sophisticated understanding of globalized trade centuries before the modern era.
The Chola state recognized that their domestic prosperity was inextricably linked to international maritime commerce.
The military fleet was deployed to protect the mercantile vessels.
This symbiotic relationship between the state's military apparatus and the commercial sector leads directly into how the Chola economic engine functioned.
Let's explore that economic engine deeply.
Let's do it.
Funding thousands of soldiers, Outfitting an armada and building massive temple complexes requires a staggering amount of capital.
It does.
According to the sources, the economy was structured in 3 distinct tiers.
Right. At the foundational base, you have the localized agricultural settlements.
The thousands of villages constantly churning out the wet rice surplus.
Moving up a level, you find the nagaram, which were the commercial towns.
These functioned as regional redistribution centers.
They took the massive agricultural surplus from the villages, traded it for manufactured goods, and also housed the artisans.
The artisans who produced textiles and metalwork for international export.
But it's the top tier that really stands out.
At the apex of this commercial hierarchy were the samyam,
The elite merchant groups.
These were immense, highly organized merchant guilds that completely dominated international maritime trade across the Indian Ocean.
The most prominent and influential among them was the Ayavol Ainuruvar.
Often referred to as the 500 lords of the country.
Exactly.
Reading about the operations of the Ayavol Ainuruvar, the immediate parallel that comes to mind is the British East India Company.
The scale is certainly comparable.
The historical records show these guilds operating essentially as autonomous multinational corporations.
They maintain their own extensive fortified warehouses in foreign ports.
They employ their own private mercenary armies to protect their overland caravans and merchant fleets.
They even possess their own banking systems to mitigate the extreme risks of long-distance trade.
But how did a medieval credit system actually function?
It's quite intricate.
In a world without digital banking or instant communication, how do you enforce a financial contract across the Indian Ocean?
The credit system functioned through complex networks of trust, reputation, and written promissory notes known as hundis.
Undis, like medieval credit notes.
Exactly. If a merchant in Thanjavur wanted to buy silk in China, carrying massive chests of heavy gold coins across pirate-infested waters was incredibly risky.
Yeah, you'd be a giant floating target.
So instead, the merchant would deposit the gold with the local guild chapter.
Okay.
The guild issued a formalized letter of credit verifying the deposit.
So the merchant traveled with this document, presented it to the guild's representatives in a foreign port, and received the equivalent value in local currency or goods.
Exactly. The system relied on the immense centralized wealth of the guild to honor these notes universally.
As for enforcement, what happens if someone cheats the system?
If a trader defaulted or violated a contract, the guild could deploy its mercenary forces.
Which is quite an enforcement mechanism.
But more effectively, they could blacklist the individual. Being expelled from the guild's trust network meant total economic ruin.
That level of autonomous power is staggering.
It really is.
If these corporate guilds had their own vast wealth, their own secure communications, and their own private armies, where was the boundary between the sovereign state power of the Chola king and the corporate power of the Ayavol Ainuruvar?
Did they ever clash the way the East India Company eventually overtook the state?
Yeah, did that happen here?
The boundary was highly porous, but unlike the East India Company, the guilds and the Chola state maintained a mutually beneficial equilibrium.
So they worked together.
The Chola kings provided the macro-level security, royal patronage, diplomatic treaties, and the naval power to break monopolies like Srivijaya.
And in return?
In return, the guilds expanded the empire's soft power and funneled immense taxable wealth back into the homeland.
Their interests aligned perfectly.
When the Chola navy cleared the Malacca Strait, it was the merchant fleets of the Ayavol Ainuruvar who sailed in immediately behind them.
To capitalize on the newly opened markets.
And the physical evidence of their overseas presence is undeniable.
The sources highlight a fragmentary Tamil inscription discovered in Sumatra, right?
Dated to the year 1088.
It explicitly mentions the Nanadesa Tisayiratu Ainushuvar.
Which is a formal variation of the guild's title.
This proves unequivocally that these Tamil merchant corporations maintained a permanent physical infrastructure operating deep within Southeast Asia.
They functioned as the vital connective tissue of the medieval Indian Ocean economy.
Back on the subcontinent, the Chola state ensured it extracted its share of this immense wealth to fund the administration.
State revenue was a matter of meticulous calculation and aggressive auditing.
The primary pillar of state income was the Kanakadan, the central land tax.
The records state the Kanakadan was generally fixed at 1/6 of the gross agricultural produce.
But how was that actually collected?
What do you mean?
It's one thing to declare a tax. It's another entirely to physically gather millions of pounds of rice from thousands of dispersed villages.
It required a massive bureaucracy.
I would imagine.
Royal surveyors physically mapped the empire, measuring every plot of arable land and classifying the soil quality.
So the tax wasn't just a blind demand.
No, it was calculated based on the specific yield potential of the land.
What happens if there's a bad harvest?
In times of severe drought or famine, the central government could and did remit or lower the tax burden.
To prevent localized economic collapse.
Exactly. The grain was collected by local officials, stored in massive state granaries, and then distributed.
Distributed to pay the standing army, fund the temple construction, and compensate government administrators.
Beyond the land tax, the sources mentioned supplementary taxes. A prominent one was the Eri-Veri.
What was the purpose of this specific levy?
The Eri-Veri was an irrigation cess.
Okay, an irrigation tax.
The entire economy, as we discussed, relied on the vast network of water tanks, canals, and barrages like the Grand Anicut.
Maintaining that infrastructure required constant labor.
Dredging silt, repairing stone embankments, managing sluice gates.
The Eri-Veri was a specialized tax collected solely to fund the maintenance of this critical hydraulic infrastructure.
It was an early form of a dedicated infrastructure tax.
To facilitate the massive volume of domestic transactions and international trade, the Cholas also developed a highly monetized economy.
They issued standardized coinage, most notably gold coins known as the kasu and the gadiana.
The strength of a currency lies in trust, right?
And the Chola state strictly controlled the metallurgical purity of their gold coins.
Their purity rivaled the contemporary Islamic dirhams circulating in the Western Indian Ocean.
Which meant a Chola kasu was readily accepted as a standard medium of exchange from the ports of Arabia to the markets of Southeast Asia.
These coins heavily featured the imperial emblem, the Chola tiger,
often depicted seated alongside two fish,
which symbolized their absolute political dominance over the rival Panda dynasty, who used the fish as their emblem.
This combined economic and military strength allowed the Cholas to operate on the highest levels of international diplomacy.
The records detail a major event in the year 1077.
When the Chola state dispatched an enormous diplomatic and trade embassy consisting of 72 members directly to the court of the Song dynasty in China,
sending 72 high-ranking diplomats and merchants on a multi-year journey across the ocean to the Chinese emperor's court is a profound display of resources.
It was a very calculated move to secure favorable tariff rates and bypass regional middlemen,
establishing a direct pipeline for Chinese silk and porcelain into the Chola markets and Indian cotton and spices into China.
When you look at the whole picture,
a society generating immense wealth through hyper-efficient local agriculture,
taxing that yield meticulously,
multiplying the capital through international corporate guilds,
and sending state-sponsored embassies to China.
You realize that managing this level of complexity requires a sophisticated administrative apparatus.
You cannot simply dictate this level of intricate economic activity from a single throne room in the capital.
Centralized micromanagement of an empire that size is impossible without modern communications.
The Cholas understood this deeply. They engineered an administrative structure that perfectly balanced absolute centralized royal authority with extreme localized decentralization.
Let's map out how this administration was structured geographically. At the absolute top, you have the king. The empire is then divided into massive territorial provinces known as mandalums.
These were vast regions, often governed by a royal prince or a highly trusted viceroy.
Each mandalum was further subdivided into smaller units called valanatis or kodams.
Moving further down the hierarchy, you find the nadis,
which were essentially the equivalent of modern districts or counties.
And finally, at the very base level of the society, you reach the urs, the individual villages.
The true genius and resilience of the Chola system did not lie in the grand provinces, though.
No, it was located at that base level within the mechanisms of local self-governance.
The villages were entirely managed by local assemblies. You had two primary types.
The Sabha was the assembly specifically for the Brahmin settlements.
These were the tax-exempt villages granted by the king to priests and scholars.
Then you had the which functioned as the council for the standard non-Brahmin agrarian villages that made up the bulk of the empire.
We have an extraordinarily clear picture of exactly how these local assemblies operated because of the Udaremur inscriptions.
These are detailed records carved into stone walls during the reign of Parantaka I in the 10th century.
They outline a governance mechanism called the Kudavalai system.
At first glance, it looks like a simple lucky draw.
Right, but looking closer, it is a highly regulated, intensely scrutinized lottery system for selecting local government officials.
It really is.
Could you walk through the exact step-by-step mechanics of how a village utilized the Kudavai system?
The Utaramur inscriptions provide a fascinating blueprint for civic engineering. Let us take a large village and break down the process.
Okay.
First, the village was divided into 30 distinct geographic wards.
The residents of each ward would gather to nominate candidates to represent them on the village council.
But this was not a free-for-all. You could not simply nominate anyone who wanted power.
The prerequisites were incredibly strict.
The sources indicate that to even be considered for a nomination, a candidate had to meet rigid financial and educational criteria.
Like what?
A candidate had to physically own a specific amount of tax-paying land. They had to own a house built on legally acquired property.
They had to be between the ages of 35 and 70, right?
Furthermore, they were required to demonstrate a deep proficiency in the sacred texts, the Vedas, ensuring a baseline of education and moral philosophy.
But equally important to the qualifications were the strict disqualifications.
This is the part that really stands out.
If you had served on any of the council committees within the previous 3 years, you were entirely barred from running again.
It was a forced term limit to prevent the entrenchment of power.
Which is incredibly forward-thinking. Furthermore, if you had served previously and failed to submit your financial accounts for the mandatory public audit,
not only were you disqualified for life, but your extended family was barred as well.
wow, that is a brutal enforcement of accountability.
Once the wards had debated and selected their eligible nominees based on these strict criteria, the actual selection process began.
How did they do the actual vote?
The names of the verified nominees from each ward were written onto individual palm leaves.
These leaves were gathered, bound together, and placed into a large earthen pot.
A massive public gathering was held in the central hall of the village temple. The oldest priests would lift the pot.
Show it to the assembly to ensure transparency.
And then a young child who knew nothing of the candidates or the politics, representing total innocence in the absence of bias, was called forward.
The child reached into the pot and drew out the palm leaves one by one to determine the council members for that year.
It is a remarkable synthesis.
It functions like modern jury duty, where citizens are called to serve, but combined with the random selection of a lottery.
All governed by incredibly strict moral and financial prerequisites.
But this brings up a massive structural contradiction.
How so?
On one hand, you have an absolute monarch sitting in Thanjavur, a king, who commands transoceanic armadas and calls himself the emperor of the three worlds.
Right.
On the other hand, at the base of society, you have this highly participatory, heavily audited, localized democratic process. How did those two radically different philosophies of power coexist without constantly clashing?
It was a pragmatic coexistence born out of necessity.
The central government in Thanjavur just had no desire to micromanage.
Exactly. They didn't want the immense bureaucratic burden of micromanaging the daily affairs, minor disputes, and agricultural schedules of thousands of individual villages.
The local assemblies were not merely symbolic advisory boards. They wielded real, actionable executive power.
They assessed the local land values and physically collected the revenue to send to the capital.
They managed the Kudamara math system, which was a civic mandate requiring community participation in maintaining the vital irrigation canals and water tanks.
If a local dispute arose over property lines or petty crime, the assembly acted as the judiciary.
So the central administration gets its guaranteed stream of tax revenue and maintains broader macro-level order.
While the local village handles its own day-to-day survival and infrastructure.
Precisely. The central government enforced accountability rather than direct control.
Royal officials, known as ad-dikaris, frequently attended the village assembly meetings.
However, they did not attend to dictate policy or overturn local decisions.
They acted as neutral observers to ensure that the annual financial audits were conducted strictly according to the law and that the central taxes were accurately tallied.
This delicate balance of centralized macro power and decentralized micro-administration created immense structural resilience.
Emperors could rise and fall, dynastic struggles could violently disrupt the capital.
But down in the provinces, the village-level administration kept the water flowing, the wet rice growing, and the societal fabric intact.
The enormous wealth generated by this local administrative efficiency, combined with the massive influx of capital from international maritime trade,
Was ultimately poured into the empire's most visible, enduring legacy.
We are talking about their monumental stone architecture and their mastery of bronze art.
The architectural transition from using perishable materials like brick and timber to utilizing immense blocks of granite marks a significant turning point in Chola history.
The absolute pinnacle of this architectural ambition is the Brihadisvara Temple at Thanjavur.
Commissioned by Rajaraja I and completed in the year 1010.
Studying the construction of the Brihadisvara Temple, it is difficult to comprehend the engineering.
The central tower, the Vimana, rises 216 feet into the air.
And this entire structure is assembled from heavily quarried granite blocks without the use of any mortar.
No mortar at all, just dry fit.
Yes. The precision of the carved interlocking joints alone holds the immense weight together.
The capstone resting at the very top of the tower weighs roughly 80 tons.
How did medieval engineers hoist an 80-ton block of solid granite over 200 feet into the air without modern cranes?
The logistical solution was brute force combined with mathematical precision.
They built a ramp, didn't they?
They constructed a massive earthen ramp, starting miles away from the temple base, gradually sloping upward to reach the peak of the tower.
They then used coordinated teams of elephants and thousands of laborers to slowly, painstakingly drag the capstone up the incline over a period of months.
But as we admire the engineering, we must remember the broader context.
These temple complexes were not just quiet religious sanctuaries intended for solitary prayer.
They functioned as the ultimate socio-economic hubs of the empire.
The temple was effectively an economic engine in its own right.
It acted as a massive employer, a vast landowner, a major consumer of local goods, and a functional bank.
The inscriptions carved into the granite walls of the Brihadisvara temple meticulously record the endowments given to it by the king, generals, and merchants.
The temple directly employed hundreds of resident dancers, musicians, accountants, guards, and administrators.
It received a designated portion of agricultural revenue from specific villages across the empire.
And the records even show revenue flowing in from conquered territories in Sri Lanka specifically to fund the temple's operations.
The temple was the central locus where religion, the local economy, and absolute state power physically intersected.
It was the heart of the city.
And housed deep within the dark inner sanctums of these massive granite structures were the true masterpieces of Chola artistry.
The bronze sculptures, created using the highly complex Sire-Purdue or lost wax casting process.
I was reading about this lost wax method in the sources, and it sounds incredibly intricate.
But also massively risky from an artistic standpoint.
You essentially have to destroy the mold to get the final statue.
How does the thermodynamics of this process actually work?
The lost wax process requires a mastery of both sculpting and metallurgy.
It begins with the master artisan fashioning a highly detailed model of the deity out of a specific mixture of beeswax, demar resin, and peanut oil.
Because wax is soft, the artist can carve excruciating detail into the model.
The delicate curve of a fingernail, the intricate patterns of a silk garment, the individual beads on a necklace.
Once the wax model is perfected, it is completely encased in several thick layers of fine, specially prepared clay.
This clay casing is allowed to dry completely in the sun, creating a solid, hard mold around the fragile wax core.
And then comes the critical phase involving fire.
The clay mold is placed into a fire pit. As the heat bakes the clay, hardening it into a rigid ceramic shell, the wax inside completely melts.
And runs out through small, pre-designed drainage channels.
The wax is lost. You are left with a hollow cavity inside the baked clay, holding the exact, intricate negative impression of the original wax sculpture.
Then the metallurgists take over. They melt a specific bronze alloy.
Primarily copper, mixed with lead and tin, and occasionally incorporating traces of gold and silver.
And they pour the superheated, molten metal into the hollow clay mold.
Once the metal cools and solidifies over several days, the artisans must take heavy hammers and physically break the baked clay mold apart
to reveal the bronze sculpture inside.
So there is absolutely no margin for error once that molten metal is poured.
If the cast fails or an air bubble forms, the entire process is ruined.
And because the mold must be completely destroyed to extract the metal, every single Chola bronze is a completely unique piece of art.
You cannot mass-produce them.
But looking at the final pieces, a question arises regarding the artistic freedom.
How so?
Well, how did the artists balance the strict, unyielding rules of the religious texts? The Shilpa Shastras, which rigidly dictated the exact proportions, the hand gestures, and the iconography of the gods, with the incredibly fluid, lifelike naturalism we see in these sculptures.
It is the defining hallmark of Chola artistic genius.
The master craftsmen internalized the rigid mathematical and iconographic rules.
They knew exactly how many arms a specific deity must possess, what symbolic objects they must hold, and the exact geometric angle of their posture.
But within those strict mandatory parameters, they injected a profound understanding of human anatomy, weight distribution, and kinetic movement.
They created divine figures bound by ancient rules that nonetheless look as though they are breathing and about to step off their pedestals.
The most globally recognized example of this mastery is the Nataraja.
The depiction of the god Shiva as the Lord of Dance.
If you look closely at a high-quality Chola Nataraja bronze, you are looking at a masterclass in complex theological storytelling rendered in metal.
Shiva is framed by a massive circular flaming aureole.
This ring of fire represents the physical boundaries of the cosmos and the endless cycle of time.
His matted locks of hair fly out horizontally on either side of his head, perfectly capturing the violent kinetic energy and centrifugal force of his rapid spin.
Tangled within those flying locks is a tiny, delicate figure of the goddess Ganga, representing the descent of the river Ganges from the heavens.
The symbolism continues into the four arms of the deity.
In his upper right hand, he holds the damaru, the small hourglass-shaped drum whose rhythmic beating pulses the universe into existence.
In his upper left hand, he holds Agni, the cosmic fire that will eventually consume and destroy the universe.
Creation and destruction are held in perfect, simultaneous, terrifying equilibrium.
His lower right hand is raised in the Abhaya Mudra,
A specific gesture of protection and reassurance, signaling to the devotee not to fear the cosmic chaos.
His right foot is planted firmly on the back of a small, struggling dwarf named Mushalagan.
Who represents human ignorance and spiritual darkness.
And his left leg is raised high and gracefully across his body, demonstrating the path to spiritual liberation.
It is an entire system of cosmology, time, and theology frozen in a single dynamic piece of bronze.
But what is absolutely vital to understand about these bronzes is their function.
They were not static museum pieces.
Mm-hmm.
They were not created merely to sit silently in a dark sanctum and be admired for their aesthetic beauty.
They were dynamic, active participants in a vibrant, highly sensory religious culture centered around the fundamental concept of darshan.
The concept of darshan is fascinating. It translates literally to seeing.
But in the context of Chola religious practice, it is not simply the passive act of looking at a statue.
It is a deeply reciprocal psychological event.
You do not go to the temple merely to look at the deity. You go to see the deity, and crucially, to be seen by the deity.
It is a visual exchange of spiritual energy.
The belief system dictates that when the priests perform the correct invocations, the divine essence of the god temporarily descends and resides within the physical bronze image.
The bronze ceases to be metal. It becomes a living, breathing entity.
Because it is treated as a living entity, it requires intense daily interaction through puja or ritual worship.
The texts describe the treatment of these bronzes, and the sensory details are overwhelming.
The daily rituals involve priests bathing the bare bronze in milk, rich curds, sweet honey, and fragrant sandalwood paste.
The smell inside the sanctum would be incredibly potent.
Then, before the deity gives a public audience to the devotees, it undergoes a total transformation.
The bare metal is tightly wrapped in layers of vibrant, heavy silk garments.
It is adorned with pounds of solid gold jewelry, rubies, and pearls donated by the kings.
It is draped in thick, fragrant garlands of fresh jasmine and marigolds.
By the time the dressing is complete, the bronze itself is almost entirely obscured. Often, only the face of the deity remains visible.
This elaborate adornment serves a theological purpose.
The external, overwhelming physical splendor is viewed as a direct reflection of the infinite inner spiritual power of the god.
The deity is treated as the ultimate sovereign, the true king of the city, holding court.
During the massive monthly and annual festivals, these lavishly decorated bronzes leave the dark confines of the temple.
They are placed into massive, intricately carved wooden chariots, which are incredibly heavy.
Hundreds of devotees physically grab the thick ropes and pull the chariots slowly through the streets of the city.
We have a beautiful descriptive vignette from the Tamil saint Sambandar,
who documents a festival in the town of Narayar.
He writes about the sheer sensory overload. The deity, resplendent in heavy silks, towering over the crowd in the chariot, while massive crowds of devotees surge forward.
Sages chant ancient verses, Professional temple dancers perform intricate routines ahead of the wheels, and heavy festival drums beat a rhythm that reverberates through the entire city.
These chariot festivals were a mechanism of profound social cohesion.
They physically integrated the entire community, breaking down daily routines.
And this highlights the deeply prominent role of Shaivism, the worship of Shiva, during the Chola period.
However, it is important to note that they maintained the multiplicity inherent in Hinduism.
Right, freely building temples and supporting the worship of Vishnu, the goddess Durga, and Ganesha as well.
The hymns that echoed through the streets during these festivals were composed by the revered Tamil saints.
The 63 Nayanmars who were devoted to Shiva, and the 12 Alvars who were devoted to Vishnu.
These hymns formalized the emotional, passionate approach to the divine known as the Bhakti movement.
There is a highly fascinating physical consequence to this intense, continuous devotion.
The daily ritual bathing, the constant rubbing of acidic curds and sandalwood paste, the dressing and undressing of the bronzes, the exposure to the elements during the chariot festivals.
Over decades and centuries, this physical interaction slowly wears away the metal.
It smooths out the sharp, pristine details the original artists carved into the wax.
Yes, and while the softening of the details on the torso or the arms is generally accepted as a mark of continuous devotion, the wear on the eyes of the deity is a completely different matter.
Why are the eyes treated differently?
Because Oshan, that crucial reciprocal visual connection of seeing and being seen, is the absolute core of the worship experience.
For darshan to occur, the eyes of the deity must be sharp, clear, and focused.
When the eyes wear out and lose their definition from centuries of ritual bathing, the spiritual conduit is compromised.
Therefore, the temple must hire specialized artisans to carefully chisel and recut fresh eyes into the ancient bronze,
physically restoring the line of sight between the human and the divine.
It is a stunning physical manifestation of a continuous living tradition that requires active human maintenance to survive.
But despite these deep, enduring cultural roots, despite the immense agrarian wealth flowing from the Kaveri Delta, the highly resilient local administration, and the naval supremacy that dominated the Indian Ocean,
the Chola Empire, like all sprawling political entities, eventually faced a period of contraction.
the decline of the Chola state was not a sudden, catastrophic collapse. It was a slow, agonizing process of political fragmentation.
The initial shift occurred under the reign of Kulotunga I, who ruled from 1070 to 1122.
His ascension represented a major dynastic shift. He was a Chola prince through his mother's lineage.
But his father belonged to the powerful Eastern Chalukya dynasty from the north.
So his ascension effectively fused the bloodlines of the Chola and Eastern Chalukya empires.
Exactly. It brought a massive infusion of new territory and briefly stabilized the political landscape.
However, as we move into the 12th and 13th centuries, the empire simply grew too vast to manage effectively.
Internal succession disputes began to drain the treasury and weaken the central authority in Tanjavur.
Simultaneously, intense external pressures began to mount on multiple fronts.
The Pandya dynasty, who had been brutally subdued centuries earlier by Rajaraja I, experienced a massive resurgence in the deep south.
Meanwhile, the aggressive Chola Empire began applying severe military pressure from the western frontiers.
The Cholas find themselves in a strategic vice.
The vast peripheral territories slowly begin to chip away. Local chieftains assert their independence, withholding their tax revenues.
As the central treasury dries up, the ability to fund the army and maintain the navy evaporates.
The dynasty officially reaches its terminus with the reign of Rajendra III around the year 1279.
When the resurgent Pandyas finally march into the Kaveri Delta and overtake the ancient Chola heartland.
It is the natural, inevitable life cycle of a massive geopolitical entity: expansion, consolidation, peak, overextension, and eventual fragmentation.
But if we analyze the totality of their reign and attempt to summarize what allowed the Cholas to maintain imperial power for over 4 centuries,
from the middle of the 9th century to the late 13th century,
it comes down to a highly successful interlocking synthesis of multiple systems.
Looking at that synthesis, what would you argue was the single element most critical to their longevity?
Was it the sheer military might of their transoceanic navy, or was it the quiet, localized civic engineering of the villages?
Right. What's your take?
While the navy is the most spectacular element, I would argue the true bedrock of their longevity was the local civic engineering.
The military might violently expanded the borders and forced open the trade routes.
The Navy protected the corporate merchant guilds, and those guilds funneled immense international capital back into the state.
But none of that operates without food and stability.
The highly participatory, decentralized coup de volaille system and the village assemblies ensured that the homeland remained incredibly stable, agriculturally productive, and socially resilient.
Even when the central leadership in Thanjavur faltered or engaged in civil war, the local villages kept the irrigation canals clear and the crops growing.
And the most remarkable aspect of this deep dive is that the Chola legacy is not merely historical trivia buried in dry texts.
No, it endures as a living, breathing reality today. The massive granite temples still dominate the skyline of Tamil Nadu.
The sensory-rich temple festivals, complete with the heavily adorned bronzes being pulled in massive wooden chariots through the streets, are still occurring right now.
The incredibly complex tradition of lost wax bronze casting continues completely unbroken in specific towns like Swamimalai.
Where artisans utilize the exact same metallurgical techniques developed under the Chola kings.
And the core administrative philosophies, the deep emphasis on localized councils and community water management, profoundly influenced the governance structures of South India for centuries that followed.
The Chola administration did not just leave behind stone ruins in the jungle. They engineered a cultural, religious, and administrative DNA that is still very much alive and functioning in the modern world.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought to mull over as we conclude.
We spent a significant amount of time detailing the mechanics of the coup de volaille system.
That hyper-local, highly participatory village government governed by strict moral qualifications, intense public audits, and lottery-based elections.
Think about the nature of modern governance.
In our contemporary world, largely defined by instant digital connectivity, massive populations, and heavily centralized bureaucratic states, have we fundamentally lost the capacity for that kind of granular community-level civic participation?
Have we lost the ability to enforce strict, localized accountability?
It is worth considering whether the highly decentralized system that successfully sustained one of history's longest ruling empires holds lessons for how we organize our own communities today.
It really is.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.